In case you guys are wondering if the service was over, it's not over, okay? For those of you that like to come just for the music and get out of here before the preaching, I do too, but I can't, otherwise they won't give me a paycheck. So, I'm here, I'm going to continue on, be present in this service, and I just want you to know that our church family has been looking forward to this day for so long. And it's a day for us. If you're part of this church community here at Epic, you know we've been looking forward to this. It's such a massive opportunity for us once a year to be able to gather on Easter Sunday and to remember things. But it's also a great opportunity to invite others to be a part of what's going on in this church community. And so I know there's a number of people who are here from out of town. I'm glad that you're here. Some of you are here visiting family. Others of you are on vacation. And I feel guilty. I don't always go to church when I'm on vacation. I know. Pastor, I know. I just need a break from it sometimes, but I'm thrilled that you're not like me while you're on vacation. But I especially want to say, if it's your first time here at Epic, or if it's your first time in a long time, welcome. I hope for those of you who hadn't been with us since last Easter, you didn't go to the wrong location. We moved in October, and so I'm thrilled that you're here. We did sign a 10-year lease on this space, so if you only come at Easter, you're good for the next 9 years, okay? Like, just keep showing up in this space, and we'll be here. Some of us will be here at least, right? Waiting for you. We're thrilled that you're here. Especially if you're a first-time guest, or if you're here for the first time in a long time, I'm thrilled that you're here because I genuinely believe that you picked the best day to show up at any church, but I think you picked the best day to show up at Epic Church. For those of you who are asking some of the bigger life questions, and even those of you who have considered and are considering becoming a Christian, like, this is the best day. We'll tell you about that on many other days and in a variety of ways. I think weekly we do that, but today is a day where we just say, hey, here is not just something that happened in history. This is what we're staking our lives on today, and it's what we're staking our forever on in eternity. And so I just want you to know that we're thrilled you're here. You came for the right reason. The second reason that it's great that you're here, if you're here for the first time, is that everything else we do as a church community, it really originates from today's big idea. And the big idea of today is this: the resurrection of Jesus Christ changes everything. The resurrection of Jesus Christ changes everything. It doesn't just change and give some religion back in the day a movement, a story to tell. It literally changes everything. Do you know that Easter shows up on calendars all around the world every single year? Easter also is, without the resurrection, we would have never started this church in 2011. There would have been no reason to have started this church just over 4 years ago without the resurrection, which means without the resurrection, this faith community wouldn't exist today. And if this faith community didn't exist today, we never would have raised money and moved into this beautiful space and signed a 10-year lease this past October. And if we had not started this church, and if this vibrant community didn't exist, then you wouldn't be here today. But if the resurrection did happen, if it really changes everything, then it makes perfect sense to start a church from scratch in downtown San Francisco in 2011, right? And if the resurrection did happen, then it makes perfect sense that you and I could belong to a vibrant faith community like this. And if the resurrection did happen, then it makes perfect sense that you're here, in spite of the rain this morning, to potentially have your life and your eternity changed forever. If the resurrection happened, then it changes everything, and it could change everything for you today. Jesus Christ and his resurrection absolutely changes everything. Which means we've got to ask a couple of questions. Did this thing happen? And how can we be convinced that it happened? And is it that big of a deal? Like, some of us are like, oh, resurrection, okay, that would be cool if it happened. I'd love to see I'd love to be there in person if it did happen. But if it didn't, no big deal. But here's what Paul says. Paul was the guy who wrote about half of the New Testament. And he was responsible in the first century for the spreading of Christianity more than anyone except Jesus himself. And he wrote a number of letters to churches he helped start. And one of those churches was in the city of Corinth. And here's one thing he said about the significance of the resurrection to the people in the city of Corinth. He said this. He said, and if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. He's saying it's so significant that if that one thing, out of all the thousands of things that Christians think and believe, out of all of the things that happened during the lifetime of Jesus, if that one thing didn't happen, then you're crazy to go along with any of it. Here's why that's important. Some of you this morning, you love some of the teachings of Jesus. Others of you love the fact that Jesus took care of the poor. Some of you love just how good of a man he was, and so you put Jesus up there with Mother Teresa and maybe Gandhi and others. But what Paul's saying is that if the resurrection didn't happen, then none of this other stuff matters. He says if there is no resurrection, then you've got nothing, and it's all a farce. He would go on later in that same chapter and say that if just in this life you've got a crutch in Jesus to hang on to and there's been no resurrection, you are of all people to be pitied most. So he's like, this is significant. And if it's this significant, we've got to ask again these two questions. Did this thing happen? And how can we be convinced of it? Now, I can't be convinced, and you can't be convinced in the way we want to be convinced. Anyone else a skeptic besides me? Really? Like, I just need to know who all the people are out there that as I say every word in a few out of the next 30 minutes, like you're just saying BS. I just need to know that as I say this happened, you're like, or, we have... Shauna and I have 3 children, and our youngest son, if you proved it to him, he would tell you you're wrong. Like if you just like, Asher, the sky is blue. He's like, nuh-uh. No, it's not. Asher, this such and such sport fact happened. His brothers would tell him. He's like, no, it didn't. And so they come to get the convinced ones, Mom and I, and they're okay. Maybe not Mom with the sports ones, but they come and they're like, Dad, did this happen? I'm like, yeah, it happened. It happened when I was a kid. I actually saw it on TV. And Asher's like, no, it didn't. I'm like, all right, so maybe that's where some of you are today. You're just like, I'm a big, big skeptic. And so what I can't do today is convince you and I in the way that we would love to be convinced. We've got some amazing entrepreneurs inside Epic Church, but none of them have done a great job inventing teleportation yet. But if they did, and some of those guys in the production booth right now, they're working on that while I'm speaking, because they've got to hear this 3 times today. If they could invent that, we could go back to Jerusalem in 30 AD. We could be there for the life of Jesus. We could be there for the death of Jesus on the cross. We could have that awkward Saturday Sabbath moment where we can't do any work, but all we can do is worry. And then we could be there for the resurrection moment where he empties and flees the tomb and he has risen. We could be there and we're like, okay, I'm convinced. I can't give you that today. But I do think I can give you the next best thing, and that's this. I think perhaps that you and I can be convinced by the convincing of those who didn't have to teleport there because they were there. And I want to show you today how unlikely it was that the people who began this movement actually began this movement. It's so crazy unlikely, and that's what I want to set up today, a little bit before and after, to show you, to demonstrate, to convince us, if possible, that this thing happened. That's my goal. So Jesus had disciples. That's not foreign to you. Even if you don't have a little bit of church background, you probably know Jesus called 12 men. He called them his disciples. They said, come follow me and I will make you fishers of men. And he didn't pick out the best or the brightest. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But he called these guys, and for practically 3 years, they spent every day with Jesus. So Jesus had upwards of 1,000+ days that he spent with these disciples. So you would think after 1,000 days, you would get to know someone, right? Well, they really didn't have a grasp, even at the end, of who he really was. You see this throughout their lives, but it really reaches a low point in the days before and the days after the death of Jesus. Let me give you a few thoughts on that. Peter, who was really one of the closest to Jesus, Peter was that guy. I don't know if you have people in your family or if you work on a team with people that if somebody dares you to do something crazy or challenges you to do something, that you have that one person that steps up. Anybody's like, I'll do it, and then they never do it because they have no clue what they're signing up for. That was Peter. But Peter, even though he was so close to Jesus, one of the really inner 3 along with James and John, Peter acted one day like he didn't even know who Jesus was. And then in John's gospel, John tells us that after Jesus died, the disciples were locked in a room because they were afraid. But I think Mark may sum it up best for these guys, just so you know how unlikely it was. Just in one short statement, talking about the 11 disciples. Remember, Judas has betrayed Jesus. Judas went and committed suicide because he felt so guilty about that. And now there are 11 of them. And I think Mark summarizes what these 11 were like and how unlikely they were to be the kind of people who pushed the message of Jesus forward. Here's what Mark says in one short statement. And they all fled him and left. Or they all left him and fled, sorry. Try not to cheat. And they all left him and fled. Every single one of them. It doesn't say that one of those guys couldn't hang with Jesus and so he bowed out. It doesn't even say that half of the people left stuck with Jesus, but the other half walked out on Jesus. It doesn't even say that 10 of them were cowards and left, but there was one who was super strong, like, had Christian Letterman jacket, the big C. It doesn't even say that. What does it say? They all. Every single one of these 11 men who knew Jesus better than anyone else on the planet, they all walked out on him. Don't you want friends like that? That are just awesome when things are going well, when you're helping them out, when you're giving them stuff, but then when the tough times come, you're like, They all walked out on him. And I think this sets up the story so well for how unlikely you and I can see that they would be the kind of people that would be pushing this message forward, so much so that you and I would be talking about them 20 centuries later. If you have a Bible, we're in Luke 24 this morning for this unlikely story. If you need one, just raise your hand. You might have an app on your phone. That's great. If you need one, raise your hand. We are prepared to hand you one, and we will not move forward until you have one in your hands if you want one. Small gift from us here at Epic to you. Again, thrilled that you're here. Luke chapter 24, and I want to set this up for us just a little bit. Jesus has died on Friday. And Saturday's the Sabbath, and so it's not just this day of waiting as we think of it, though that's part of it. It's a day of waiting where you can do nothing. Anyone do a lot of busy work whenever you're nervous about something? Well, this was forbidden, right? So some of you are like, all right, I took a couple showers today, but I'm anxious, so I'm going to take another shower. I'm going to wash clothes that are clean, or I'm going to wash the dish. They couldn't do any of that. They're just waiting, and they didn't have a smartphone, all right? I know, so much like 2 minutes the bus, okay, Twitter, USA Today, whatever, right? They had none of that. They were just waiting, and they could not do anything. It was against their religion. It's crazy. But these women who were close to Jesus, and don't miss the significance of the women in the resurrection story, ladies and men, do not miss the significance of the women in the story. They are going to be preparing spices and ointments for the body of Jesus, and so that's where they are headed Easter morning. They couldn't do that on the Sabbath, so they're headed to do it as soon as the sun rises. So stand with me. Let's look at Luke 24. 1 through 12. So got a few seats up front if anybody needs one. I'm not spitting today. Here's what Luke says. But on the first day of the week, that's that Easter day, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise?" And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now, ladies, you ever find it hard to convince a man of something that's true? Anybody? Listen to this. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. You may be seated. And again, the case for today is we want to be convinced that this thing happened or that it didn't. We want to be able to walk out of here and go, all right, because of what I've heard, I feel more likely that it didn't happen, or I feel more likely that it did happen. But listen to this. If you're a person today who doesn't yet believe in the resurrection, I want to comfort you by telling you're in really good company. Think about it like this way for these disciples. These men started a movement based on the resurrection, though they found it too amazing to believe at one time. This is profound. These men started a movement based on the resurrection story, though they found it way too amazing to believe at one time. Here's the only equivalent I can give you. The equivalent is this. You're in the room this morning. You don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. And if you look at the timeline of the disciples and all this, here's what it would be like. It would be like you not believing in the resurrection of Jesus today and you having my job 2 months from today. Can you imagine that? Now, don't be afraid of having to have this job, okay? I need to put food on the table, and I have no other marketable skills, okay? So we are not headed there. But that's the equivalent. They believe it's fairy tale. They believe it's fantasy. In 2 months from then, they begin to preach, even shorter really, they begin to preach this story. So you're in good company today. If you're a person right now, you're like, Ben, I'm just too logical. So are they. Ben, I just need to be proved. So did they. Ben, I just need to know that there's a valid reason for me to base my life, and especially you say my eternity on this. I need to be shown. So did they. And how unlikely is it that these guys would be the ones leading the movement? The ladies go to the tomb. They have this experience. They have an experience with a couple of people dressed in dazzling apparel. Now, I know what you're thinking, so I just want to, in every city, you don't have to share this context, but I know some of you have seen these people around San Francisco in dazzling apparel. That's not that, all right? That is not that. These are angels, okay? And like real angels, no matter what they say their name is. These are real angels. Only in San Francisco. And the women have this experience, and then they come back. They finally, in verse 8, they remembered the words. They returned from the tomb. They told all of these things to the 11. All of these men heard the same story from these women. You can imagine their faces were excited. They're like, you're not going to believe this, but, and they're like, you're right, we don't believe it. Fairy tale. Made up story. No possible way. But thankfully, Peter's curiosity was piqued enough that he was willing to go explore. And for you, maybe you're just in the seat today where Peter was. You're not believing this yet. But would you allow your curiosity to be heightened at least enough that you would come and examine the truth? Would you allow it to be enough, just your curiosity, just peak just a little bit, that you would come and see, did this thing happen? It's at least worth me finding out and making sure that I can close the door on this. When Peter goes to the tomb, I'm convinced he is not a man of great faith in the resurrection, but I believe having faith that it did not happen, he wants to make sure that it did not happen so he can close that chapter and go back to fishing and just sort of have the life he expected to have before Jesus called him. And I don't know where you're at this morning, but if you're at that place of unbelief, I just want to encourage you to at least have your curiosity heightened enough, just a little bit heightened so that you can come in and examine, did this thing happen? Because if it did, it really changes everything. If this thing really did happen, it changes everything. So how did these guys go from thinking this is an idle tale to making this story something they would give the rest of their lives to, both in how they lived and in how they died? How did they go from thinking it's an idle tale to being the guys responsible for spreading the movement forward? So much so that all around the globe today, their stories of resurrection are being told. How it's so unlikely. Are you with me? Like, if anybody's unlikely, you think you're unlikely to become a Christian before you leave the room today? Not as unlikely as these guys. They had seen it. They had hoped in it. Their hope had been completely deflated. They're checked out of it. They think it's over and done. And yet they become the ones who are entrusted and move forward, spreading the movement so far that we would start a church in San Francisco, downtown, 2011, and that you would be in the room with us this morning. Pretty unlikely. And I would say probably more unlikely than you becoming a Christian today. So how would this happen? What would it take for them to make this shift? What would it take for you to make this shift? For them, they would have to become convinced that this thing truly happened. There is no other plausible explanation. I'm going to show you a number of things this morning, and you'll see there's just no other plausible explanation that they would give their lives to this message if they didn't think this message was true and if they had not been convinced that this thing actually happened. Let me show you one moment, the night of Easter. It's from John's Gospel in John 20, verse 19. I referenced it earlier, but here's what's going on the night of Easter. They don't know about the resurrection yet, or they don't believe it. And it says, on the evening of that day, the first day of the week, that's Easter day, the resurrection day, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." Peace be with you. Why are they locked in a room? Because they're afraid of the Jews. Why are they afraid of the Jews? Because it's these Jewish leaders who have just executed their friend Jesus, and they've been associating with Jesus. Makes sense, doesn't it? And I love that Jesus shows up and he doesn't condemn them for their unbelief, and he doesn't make fun of them for being afraid. He doesn't even say, like, gotcha, Although that would be an appropriate response, it seems like fooled you. He says to them these words, "Peace be with you." Do you know what he's saying in that moment? Peace be with you. He is saying that this thing hasn't ended like you thought it did. And some of you need to hear that. Some of you are in marriages, and it seems like because it's over, everything's over. Some of you are in careers, and because it seems over, you think everything's over. Some of you are in financial struggles, and because it seems like that part of your life is no longer going to be abundant, everything is over. And what Jesus is saying is what you think has ended has not quite ended. That's the story of the resurrection. That's what he tells them. And then these guys begin to move this forward. The book of Acts, what it does is contain how the church got off the ground. And the way Acts begins is Jesus has died. He's experienced the resurrection. He's risen, and then he rises a little bit more. He ascends back into heaven. And then these guys, these non-believers from a moment ago, these idle-tale believers from a moment ago, they now are entrusted to take this movement forward. And they begin talking about what they've seen Jesus do. And so much so that the religious leaders in the first century, they begin to say to them, you've got to stop talking about this. I want you to see this in Acts. It'll be on the screen. Acts 4:18 through 20. So they, that's the religious leaders, called them the disciples and charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. How do these guys go from not even acknowledging they know Jesus to not being able to shut up about Jesus? What would have to happen for that shift to take place? Well, it's what they told us at the end of verse 20, right? Like, hey, we've just seen something. It's one of those kind of things that we've seen that we can't stop talking about it. And we all have these things. When things happen in our lives that we expect, we may share that with someone if it's a good thing, even though it's expected. We may share that, but we can eventually stop talking about it, right? But when something really exciting happens, we keep going for a while, but these guys are still today talking about that. They haven't gotten over it. It's changed everything. I don't know if any of you, some of you that didn't grow up in church, you missed some good things probably, but you missed some bad things probably. Anyone ever go to youth camp, like as a teenager at church youth camp? It's kind of the vibe we're trying to create here at Epic. I just want to get you cry. If you'll be crying, but how many of you did that? Or maybe for my town, they would bring this thing called a revival to town. And I knew how youth camp would go, or these revival things. I would start, I would be such a sinful 14-year-old before the camp began. And the pastor would just reel me in, tell me I'm sinful, and, all that. True statement, absolutely true, especially at 14. Yeah, it's true. And then somehow the worship leader would come up and he'd hit that right key. I don't even know what that key is, but he'd hit it on the keyboard. But the guitar thing didn't take off till after I was a teenager, but... and we'd be in tears. And then we'd make these grand commitments to go and to burn all of our terrible CDs. And I got about 3 good days out of that new lifestyle. Anybody else? And the worst was whenever that spiritual high, whenever it was over, the worst thing was I didn't feel that anymore, and I still couldn't listen to MC Hammer. It was terrible. Yes, it happened. Well, one of the things that you've got to be convinced of is these guys didn't have just like this aha 3-day experience like youth camp. They built their lives on it, and their death was even built on this. So much so that you and I would be talking about them in a basement underneath a CVS on Market Street in 2015. It was really that big. It was really that big of a difference. And so they say we can't stop talking about what we've seen and heard. Now, one thing we forget is that it's not just that the resurrection was the only amazing thing that these guys saw Jesus do, right? I mean, if you look back at the life of Jesus and what they observed, they saw just some killer things from Jesus. They saw Jesus heal all kinds of diseases that people had. They saw Jesus walk on water. That'd be kind of amazing. They saw Jesus cast demons out of people. I'd love to watch that one on TV, but not be present for it. They saw Jesus say to a raging storm and the waves, and in a moment's notice, it shut down on the water that day. They saw Jesus even die on the cross. But here's what's interesting. There's something different about this amazing thing compared to all of the other amazing things. Ben, what do you mean, and how do you know? Well, what I know is this, that they did not have the kind of resolve they have now after they saw any of those other things. None of those things. They're like, wow, you've got some power. They did say that. They're like, wow, you can do a lot. Wow, you care for people. Wow, how did you do the fish and bread thing? That's amazing. You're kind of a magician. But they did not have something in and of those things to build their lives on. They needed something more. They needed a trump card, and nothing was a trump card for them until they came face to face with the reality of the resurrection. And for them, that is what trumped everything. That is a difference maker for them. If they were to be here today, they'd be like, hey guys, tell us what convinced you. They could tell you stories about what they saw Jesus do, but we know they never were convinced from those stories. They were not convinced, even after seeing Lazarus die and come back to life, right? Jesus doing that, they still didn't have a trump card in their back pocket. Not until they saw their Lord and Savior, Jesus, die and rise again, did they live life and eternity with that trump card. Because here's the thing. We're looking for a trump card too. We're looking for some way to make our lives better. We're looking for something that we can hang our hat on and say, like, hey, this is the thing. Because here's what you've got to know, and you know this already, but think about it in their context. You don't go from weakness to strength when you lose your leader for good. You just don't. You don't go from fear to faith when the guy who's kept the entire group together walks out. You don't go from being afraid of everything to being afraid of nothing unless you have something that convinces you shouldn't be afraid of anything. You don't go from being afraid of everything to being afraid of nothing. Now they have no fear of persecution. They have no fear of imprisonment. And if you watch their lives unfold and end, they have no fear of death itself. How do you get to that point? Because here's what we know to be true. Whatever your thought is about these stories, what we know to be true is that all of us at times, yes, every one of us, we make up stories that benefit us in some way, right? There's some of you guys have started dating a girl recently, and she thinks you have a better job than you do, right? Don't raise your hand. Just time to come clean. She loves you for you. No, I'm not going to sing. I tell stories and make up stories to myself that benefit me. Like, I'm still convinced that I could play Major League Baseball. Seriously? Wow. It's a congregation that tells me they believe in me, and I drop that, and they're like, no, I'm convinced. If the scouts would just come see me dominate my sons in wiffle ball, I believe. Listen, I mean, in San Francisco, you've got shorter fences, but I'm a home run king. 15-foot patio out back. But we do this. We make up stories to make us feel better about ourselves or for someone else to be more impressed with us or somehow to gain a social standing, right? We all do this. But you don't make up stories that will put your life in harm's way. You want to know what the stories of the resurrection accomplished for the disciples? Let me tell you what their stories of the resurrection of Jesus accomplished for them. James, who was one of the inner three, the brother of John, along with Peter. James, Herod killed him by the sword. Peter, history tells us, was crucified, and that he was crucified upside down. Yes, the same Peter who said, I don't know who Jesus is, died upside down for Jesus. His brother died in a similar fashion. In fact, it appears that John was the only disciple who died of natural causes. Now, you tell me how you get from locked in the room afraid to laying down your life in some horrific manner if you were at a place of disbelief. If you were at a place of thinking it's a fairy tale, if you were at a place of fleeing the one who meant so much to you at one point in time, you don't get to the other place unless you become convinced of something that you can stake your life on, and they became convinced of it. That Easter has a daily reality for us. It's not a once in history. It's not a once a year thing. It's a once forever. It has changed it all. It has changed it all. I want you to hear how Peter, there's 27 books in the New Testament. More like letters, and there's 27 of them, and Peter wrote 2 of them. And Peter, this guy who denied Jesus, Peter, this guy who didn't believe, Peter, the guy who didn't have it all together, he begins his first letter by giving a greeting, and then he gives this is his very first thought after his greeting. He says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us, or he has made us, or he has enabled us to be born again, to be new creations, to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead." It changed everything for him. He's now writing to these people who are living in times of persecution, and he's saying this, that it's okay. Blessed be our God and Father. Because of his great mercy, he has caused us. He has made us to be born again. He's made us a new creation. He's given us a living hope through one means only. Only one thing. He doesn't even say, hey, he gave us this living hope because he lived a good life. He gave us this living hope because he washed our feet. He says, no, he gave us a living hope through one means necessary, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And he stakes the rest of his life on it. Now, you and I are all looking for something to make our lives a little bit better. Every one of us in this room wish we had more peace and less anxiety. Every one of us in this room wish that we lived with more confidence and less fear. Every one of us in this room wish we could find the secret to joy regardless of the circumstances in our lives. We all wish that, and so we'll do whatever it takes, right? We'll sign up for crazy plans. We'll start online dating. We'll start a diet thing. I've started a lot of diets. I've never finished one. We will do whatever it takes. We'll read books, and those can be good. We'll go to therapy, and that can be really helpful. We'll enter into relationships that can enhance our lives. We'll try to go after something monumental in the working world and accomplish something, and I'm all for that. We'll start serving the less fortunate because we don't want to just be consumers. We want to be contributors, but not one of those good things will become and is the trump card for your life. You need something that's more decisive. You need something that speaks a final word over whatever is in your life that right now has defeat over it. And the resurrection is that. Through the resurrection, Jesus is whispering to us, it is not over. It speaks a final word. So pain in your life doesn't get the final word. Sin in your life doesn't get the final word. Your health, when you lose it, that doesn't have the final word. Even death itself does not get the final word because the resurrection is screaming to us this morning, it's not over. Many of you know, Sean and I, we've been in the adoption process in India for 3 years. And I wish he was here, but the resurrection informs me that I can still live with hope. And you guys need to pray this week too, all right? Supposed to have a hearing this Thursday. He entered into this process literally 3 Aprils ago. But I believe that the resurrection is telling me, Ben, this thing is not over. I've got a final word. I've got something more decisive. And even if you don't get what you want in this way, this is not the end. And we need that. Because here's the thing. When you lose your career, it's not over. Your career is over, but the it I'm referring to is the eternal life, this power. I'm not saying it has to be, all right? Some of you are like, oh no. Listen, one pink slip doesn't end a career, okay? And some of you, one career is going to end and you can start another. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that when you lose the career you think you can't live without, Jesus has something better. And when you lose a relationship that you think you can't live without, Jesus still has something better. And when you lose your health, he's got something better. And when one day that comes and you and I lose our lives themselves, he's still got something better where he's saying it is not over because of one thing in history that's our present and future reality, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The tragedy that happened in Kenya this week. Terrible. And as I report on the story, of course, certainly most of it was true, right? Many of them Christians. I don't know, 147 or so, many of them Christians. That part's true. The only part that isn't true is that this isn't their end. This isn't their end. And some of you right now are staking your life on a career or on a person or on an accomplishment, and at some point that's going to fade. It can be true for me. I can stake my life on, man, we're building this great church in downtown San Francisco. One day, I won't be the pastor here. I've got to have something else to stake it on. I love my marriage. Sean and I will celebrate 15 years in December. But I can't stake my ultimate hope on this. I love my children. I can't stake my hope on that. I love living in San Francisco. But if they keep raising rents, I will not be able to stake my hope on that either. Jesus gives me something more final. He gives me something more decisive. And some of you are carrying around defeat in a part and maybe even over your entire life, and it doesn't have to continue to carry you. Jesus is going, I've got something better. And so how do we respond? I think this demands a response. For some of you, you're ready. You've been processing some things before you came in this morning, or maybe just through this message this morning, you're ready to step across the line of faith and to stake your life and your eternity on this resurrection reality. I want to invite you into that. There's a spot on this card where you can just check that you're interested in giving your life to Christ. And also there are staff and leaders who will be in our Connection Center. If you haven't been to this space, that's just the glass room right outside the auditorium. Some people call it the Fishbowl Connection Center. I just call it that room behind us. But you can go there and have someone pray with you. You can share the faith decision that you're making this morning, that you're staking your life on this. You can ask questions of some of our staff and leaders there, and I want to encourage you to take that step. Others of you, though, I know you're not there yet. Let me give you a commitment that's not that, but I think would be a helpful one. Hopefully your curiosity has at least been heightened a little bit, and you would be willing to just say, hey, I'll start attending this It's Not Over series that's kicking off next week. It's just going for April and May, that when you're in town, you'll just show up. We won't do anything ask you to do anything weird or strange, thankfully. But you'd be willing just to engage in the series. We talk about these kinds of things and other things about how there are times in our lives where we lose a relationship or we lose a job and it seems like it's over, but God sometimes is just creating a new beginning. And we'd love for you to walk through that series with us. And one of the best ways we form community here at Epic and discuss our faith is through what we call our Epic groups. 30 of those are going on all around the city right now, but we're starting 2 brand new ones a week from today. It's just a 6-week, so it's time-bounded, just a commitment to make where you sit in your home with, or here at the church maybe with 8 to 12 other people and just talk about the kind of things we're discussing this morning and other things that have to do with life and faith. I'm thrilled that you're here today. It's always interesting as I think about what do we do this year? Like, there's only one story with Easter, right? How do we tell it differently? But the reality is this. If you were to ask me, like this is just me personally, Ben, why the resurrection? Why do you hold so much weight in that thing? It's what I've shared with you today. There's no other plausible explanation that these guys could go from full of fear to full of faith. There's no way these guys could be afraid of losing their life for something they don't really even think is true to being willing to lose their life for something they've been convinced is true. And that's why we're talking about it today. The resurrection of Jesus Christ can change everything. Would you pray with me? I just want to say a prayer for you, wherever you're at this morning. For those of you that are ready to place your faith in Jesus and in this resurrection, like this isn't just a Sunday thing. This is a forever thing. And so I just want to encourage you just to say to Jesus, Jesus, thank you that you died on the cross for my sin. And thank you that you didn't stay dead, that you rose again, overcoming death so that I might overcome everything in life and in the life to come. And those of you that have a relationship with Jesus, I want to encourage you, remember, this isn't an Easter thing. This is a moment-by-moment reality for us. So if your marriage is struggling, it's not over in terms of this life and the life to come. If things aren't going how you wish they were in your career, it's not over. We've been giving a living hope. We've been given this trump card that supersedes everything else. And for those of you that walked in this morning and had no intentions of ever believing this, I hope at least that your curiosity has been piqued and that you would at least be willing to be open-minded and open-hearted about what we've talked about today. Jesus, we couldn't say thank you enough. Yes, for all that you did that we read about, for multiplying the fish and the loaves of bread, for washing the feet of the disciples, for loving your enemies, for taking care of the poor, for showing us where to put our hope. But we thank you most of all that after you died on the cross, you rose again, and so you have spoken a final word over our lives. I pray that we would embrace that. I pray that our faith would be in that. In your name I pray. Amen. Would you stand as our band leads us in a response song?